And we're live. Welcome to the Anarchist News Review from Freedom Press, freedompress.org.uk, freedomnews.org.uk. I'm Freedom Editor Uri Gordon, joined tonight by Josie O'Sullivan, our man in Berlin. Good evening to you. We're
Evening.
probably going to spend most of this broadcast talking about Gaza, talking about the repression of protests for Gaza, both in the UK, both in Germany, where Josie has written an article recently, and about this repression. I think it's maybe a little bit of a sign of hope that the intentional starvation policy towards Gaza is now finally sort of breaking out into mainstream consciousness in the West in a way that hasn't been before. I mean, we've had pictures of emaciated infants, malnourished, even on the front page of the Daily Express, one of the most right-wing papers in Britain. Um, we also continuing demonstrations in Tel Aviv as well as in London and Berlin, against this disaster. And we can only hope, I guess, at this point that and this is sad to say as anarchists, but that the superpowers and that the world's powerful states will finally come to their senses at this point. We were already warning, I think, many months ago, when already the death toll in Gaza was reaching, beyond the 10,000, that this was only a prelude to the terrible disaster and catastrophe that would happen with the deliberate starvation policy of the Israeli government. And we are seeing that happen now. I mean, there have been, of course, many also international reports, from the UN and from other bodies. The World Health Organization, I think, chimed in today, and it's very clear that this is sort of how mass atrocities roll as it happens. I mean, we may never find out, what the Wannsee Conference moment was of this genocide,
Absolutely.
and who the clerks and who the politicians who made what decisions were exactly. We may never find out. But it's very clear, and also if you're exposed to Israeli social media, to the mentality on the street in Israel, that it's not that people don't know, it's that many people are actually being supportive of this. I think that
Absolutely.
there is
Absolutely.
a terrible there's a terrible shame and a terrible stain on Israeli society, which is, as people know, where I grew up, that certainly won't be erased for decades or generations.
Mhm.
Um, Nevertheless, we can hope at this point that public exposure in the mainstream media is going to mean that there will be some shift. I mean, we've seen, declarations, right? There was a joint declaration by the British government, the French government, and other governments about the need to end the war, the need to reach a ceasefire, for the humanitarian aid to go in properly, and of course, for the Israeli captives to be given back. All of that, but sometimes that just reminds me of their declarations about climate change,
Absolutely.
and other things that are just that, without significant operative um, steps behind them. And I think, and maybe one other inspiring point to see is the degree to which, at least, the public, in at least in Western countries, what we can see is very much opposed to what's going on. How much governments are out of step with their own publics on what's going on in Gaza, and on the theo-fascist policies of the current Israeli government, which perhaps explains the levels of repression that we've been seeing lately. I mean, Josie, you've written for us a quite an extensive account of how that's been playing out in Germany. I mean, it was our impression that the repression of Palestine protests in Germany is something equivalent to what happens in authoritarian regimes,
Yep.
some kind of a general exception to freedom of speech and freedom of protest. Would maybe you'd like to comment more on that?
Absolutely. I don't think it's particular to Germany, but the repression impacts the whole of society, not just through the police, but through the court systems, through the media, through academia. And through this, we see a specific targeting of Palestinians and Palestinian refugees, especially those who take a public platform. So realistically, in terms of this society, we're seeing a silencing of the Palestinian experience, whilst at the same time a kind of using other people's experiences to try to justify some of the most terrible terrible acts human beings are capable of. I think in that way, what we're seeing is a repression that is starting to normalize. So in terms of hope, I'm at least from here, I'm seeing it being crushed in ways that unimaginable. It's really difficult to describe this. It's taken me about 2 years, and there's a number of different journalists who are working here at the moment to try to expose this. The violence really seems to be focused on Palestinians, especially Palestinian refugees, and especially those on a larger scale who are applying for asylum and are going through this kind of process. The purpose of it then is to expand to other areas of life and to come out of this specific example, to instigate this violence against all migrant societies. And we can see that also with the change of political structure in Germany, much more towards the right, from what was already a kind of center-right SPD-led situation. So I feel with this, it's crushing all forms of expression, and it follows the law, basically. I find some parallels with the United Kingdom in the fact that laws are passed underneath other laws. So, for instance, Hamas was prescribed as a terrorist organization, and any association to it in this country is banned. But what they also passed was a law that said that it's forbidden to say the sentence, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Because that sentence in the mind of the German judiciary is associated to Hamas, which was established in '87, far after this phrase has been used. By doing so, it means that you can wrap up a lot of different activists in lengthy trial cases. None of them really will go to the extent where someone will have to serve prison time in many cases or a fine. The purpose is to wrap up organization and activists into trying to get their comrades out of prison. And
Yeah, I
that's the
mean,
pattern I see across. Yeah.
sure. I mean, that's kind of that attrition effect, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
of prosecution that just gets people doing solidarity instead of doing activism, but also
Mm-hmm.
more broadly, I think the political chilling effect that this
Yeah.
brings. And going back to the UK, since the proscription of Palestine Action, we have seen, for example, police forces engage in very loose interpretation of this law,
Yeah.
because all that they need now is sort of reasonable suspicion that someone supports the proscribed organization, which they might just construe as, okay, you're holding a Palestinian flag,
Sure.
or you're just saying end the genocide. That arouses suspicion that you're a supporter of Palestine Action, which is nonsense, because that is just one of many
Mm-hmm.
Palestine solidarity organizations that have existed in this country.
Yeah.
But it's precisely that political effect, and it doesn't help that the judges later say that the police are misinterpreting the law. it's that chilling effect that is caused by this kind of legislation. And
Yep.
there's, of course, there have been people who got arrested over the past 2 weekends. There's been over 200 arrests
Hmm.
in the UK by people who defied the ban, who sat with signs that saying that they support Palestine Action. That were about, yeah, I think 96 arrests
Yep.
in England over the weekend. Although interestingly, in Edinburgh and Derry, police kind of left those protests alone. So
Mm.
there's clearly a reluctance to enforce what is obviously a very draconian piece of legislation in some parts of the UK. Um, and like you said, I think another point of this chilling effect is, in a way, something where Palestine and Gaza sort of happens to be the topic around which this is happening. But
Yep.
I think what is really sort of driving the proscription of Palestine Action in this country, and we can talk about Germany later, is the fact that it is a group that is engaging in effective and nonviolent direct action,
Yep.
uh, in the sense that they are, I mean, essentially using, I mean, I think that if anything, what this reminds me of is the crackdown on SHAC, on Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, which was an anti-vivisection campaign that was working in this country, in Britain some years ago, where their tactic was about going for the corporate infrastructure and going for the companies that provide cleaning services, or the companies that provide various maintenance services, or buildings, or truck companies. And what they mainly did was massive phone-in campaigns. It wasn't even nonviolent direct action in any kind of physical way. They just, and because it was animal rights and animal experiments, is something that was,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think, also much easier, to mobilize people around in this
Hmm.
country compared to Palestine. And because it was experiments rather than the meat industry, because you have this kind of weird contradiction where,
Yep.
people will be up in arms about experiments in beagles, but, they'll eat other animals and
Absolutely.
serve them to their dogs. But anyway, and so they just got, hundreds of grannies to, like, just get on the phone to these people, and never, and because of that, the repression against that campaign was massive.
Yep.
um,
Absolutely.
and I think there's a general sort of feeling, I think, in the ruling class, that um, Palestine Action is it's not just about Palestine, not just about the arms industry, and not just about British-Israeli relations, as much as it is about the apparent effectiveness
Yep.
of nonviolent direct action, which is
Absolutely.
not coordinated, which comes from all kinds of directions.
Exactly.
Um, and but the prescription isn't really going to make a difference to that, in a way, because already, just the other day, we saw a group called, yeah, Sheffield group called Stop Arming Israel, which has existed for years,
Yep.
and they, in their name, are now, have blockaded a factory that supplies parts to engines that go into F-15s. And I mean, they just stood in front of the gates. It was absolutely nonviolent,
Yep. Absolutely.
and now the question is, will the government rush to proscribe them too? Will it become this? I mean, like, what we've seen, by the way, from the court case already, is that the action at RAF Bryce Norton, where they sprayed some paint on airplanes, is not one of the actions on the basis of which the government is saying that they were prescribed. They're claiming
Yep.
that the process to prescribe them was taking place already quite a while before. Um, but I mean, I think we're going to have to wait for the results of the judicial review with that. I think we were told that would take about another week.
Yep.
Um, and one of the things that strike me is that really this prescription is so draconian
Hmm.
and so exaggerated that the judiciary in Britain, being still relatively independent and not as overtaken by right-wing interests as it has been in the United States, Hungary, Israel,
Yeah,
for that matter, um, will, I hope, but I think there's a good chance that this will be stricken down, just because it's so grotesque. Which doesn't
absolutely,
mean they won't find other, ways to
for
legislate
sure.
against it, and other ways to repress it. But it seems that there has been not a clever political choice here on part of the Labour government,
No, not at
uh,
all. Uh,
once it's already so far out of step, sorry, with the public, uh, to to essentially apply the same sort of, we're going to do this, like, we're Reform UK but more effective and efficient attitude that they've been taking, right? Labor is consistently kind of,
absolutely.
you know uh, uh, routing the Tories from the right. I mean, on immigration, most famously.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we'll just get better at stopping the boats, rather than trying to ask, okay, how do we solve this entire migration crisis? I mean, it's a migrant crisis because these are people who are
No, of course,
suffering and
of course.
drowning, and there have to be better solutions than just looking tough. But they are, again, playing to this sort of imagined electorate.
Because
Um,
I'm sorry, they have nothing really. It's apparent that they have nothing left in terms of any links to the labor movement over the last. So what else can you realistically do except for being a conservative party that kind of appeals to people's guilt? I don't want to vote Tory. At the same time, maybe these people will do. But in terms of disabilities, as we just saw as well with the cuts, they're in the same league, in the same step, because they seem to be part of the same organizations that want the same kind of reforms, especially in the case that I just mentioned, to try to completely privatize disability insurance by making it the worst possible system imaginable. But those reforms and the Department for Work and Pensions naming in itself was part of the Labour Party. These parties seem to work off each other in competition to be the worst party imaginable for, as you say, an imagined electorate, and also a kind of designation of the working class as racist, reactionary, selfish, only wanting short-term gains. And then also, despite the fact that the working class also appear to own property, so it seems to be very heavily leaning towards the rights of landlords as opposed to the rights of tenants. So there's no surprises, no, from the Labour Party. I'm kind of surprised that the proscription of Palestine Action didn't happen under the Tories. Um, but the Labour Party, as we see, have a history with this, especially using the Terrorist Act, um, especially during the Iraq War. There are many videos I've seen of old people being shuttled away for the audacity of speaking out, sometimes at the conference itself, the Labour Party conference, speaking out against the war in Iraq and being pulled viciously away. So this seems very much in step with what the Labour Party are about, to be honest, and there are no surprises. I'm glad you have hope. There is a reason why I'm not in the UK, and definitely hope is one of these rare items. I do have a lot of hope from people. So people in the UK are the only source of hope that I can find. People who fight back, who are in solidarity with each other. This strong kind of movement, and long-standing solidarity with Palestine solidarity and these things. In 2016, I was actually in Shenstone in near uh, one of these factories for Ilbit, and this is before Palestine Action, no? Like 4 years before the establishment, at least, of the name. We look at any movement, really, we see that they're interlinked with the ones that come before. As long as they listen, as long as people have the ability to speak to each other, to have a common memory, a collective memory that we can work off. And I remember I was going to go down there. I went down there, and they'd already made it illegal the day before to enter this area. That's how they were trying to deal with it in the past. So if you enter this area, then you've broken the law. And so it doesn't really matter what you've done. You're already illegal before before the act in itself.
Well, I
And I
mean,
thought that
this is
was
something
mental.
that,
That
sure. I mean, this is something that was, essentially adopted from the sort of red zones
yeah,
established around summit protests
yeah,
in the preceding years, right? And where in America they also sort of had the cynicism to create these free speech zones, right? This is kind of the penned-in
yeah,
area where you can do your protest, and absolutely, I mean, there's a lot of this that has been going on, in a direct line from the Blair years,
yeah,
in a way that really has made the Labour Party into a party of a reaction, in a way that in some aspects is sort of less entrenched in traditional generational wealth, but nevertheless I think is much more kind of, yeah, neoliberalist in
yeah,
its attitude. Um, and like I think you made this point before that since it has no longer been a plausible proposition to say that neoliberalism brings everyone prosperity, which is what they were trying to sell, 30 years ago.
yeah,
Um, all that was really left for governments later is to defend people or to sell to people that they're being defended from some kind of threat,
yeah,
right? Whether that's terrorism or migration
mhm,
or whatever else. Um, and and in a way that is also something that has been shown up as a cover for just further accumulation of wealth and power by
absolutely,
existing political and business elites. So in a way we've sort of reached the sort of fuck you, we rule stage of democratic politics where
hmm
there is this rapid move, more explicitly in some countries and more subtly in others, away from even the sort of formal guarantees of liberal democracy.
yeah,
What's really interesting though in this context, and I wonder whether you had any thoughts on that, was the lowering of the voting age in Britain that's been declared, like, to down to age 16. What strikes me is that, and again, this is more of a gut feeling than something that's really based on surveys and statistics, but that younger groups, and I think there are statistics to show this, are in general much more progressive,
yeah,
both on economic and international topics. Um, and I wonder whether sort of labor is simply banking on its on the stranglehold that the two-party system has in this country on people's options, in the
yeah,
sense that labor, as long as there isn't a real sort of political opening, and this is still within the world of party politics, of course, with all the limitation that this has, but just in terms of analysis of what's going on in mainstream politics, this kind of stance that labor can go, well, you don't want these other guys to get in,
absolutely,
and where whoever else it is, the Greens or another left party, or whoever, just don't have the space either in the media or in the electoral system to really make any difference. And I think there is a sort of interaction between how open the official state political system is
yeah,
and the space that there is for social movements to do things. I've never been one of those, the worse the better people who, because history shows us that it's not under conditions of repression and reaction that progressive social movements flourish,
yeah,
right? It is actually in periods of a relative easing of authoritarian control, where we have a progressivist situation, a progressivist wave, a progressivist generation,
hmm
and those create the opportunities for social movements to move things further, in terms of actual social change and dismantling systems of concentrated power.
yeah,
Um, so it does leave me wondering, and again, as an anarchist, it's sort of a sign of the hopelessness of these times that I have very, no immediate expectations of a grassroots surge that's going to be able to make a lot of difference within the existing political confines, but
absolutely,
whether we might be entering into within the next decade or so, as the Trumps and Netanyahus of the world die off, and as the electorate, in as much as it still has a franchise, is much more progressive, a period where there might be a shift in the mainstream political system. Now, of course,
Yeah.
the response to a much more progressive electorate coming in is to bar the possibilities from that having a meaningful effect on the mainstream political system. So whether that's through, co-opting their leaderships, funneling it into things like the Labour Party, the Democratic Party, or whatever else, or through disenfranchisement.
Yeah.
I think that, certainly in the U.S. and in the countries that are going through a right-wing populist period right now, whether that's Hungary or Israel or elsewhere, um, there are very clear steps being taken to rig the political game,
Yeah.
including, of course, the kind of a takeover of the judiciary, but also everything that has to do with, voting conditions, requirements. There's been a bit with ID cards and so on in this country even as well, and that might be indeed the next step, in as much as we can see that we are in a period of retreat from nominal democracy, from formal democracy. So and then we end up in a situation where, the demands of the social movement, of the resistance to the regime, is going to be a return to the liberal democratic status quo that preceded the authoritarian wave, rather than
Absolutely.
actual social transformation. I think that is kind of the problematic long-term effect that we're facing from this current authoritarian wave.
Definitely. But with, I would say the shift in mainstream, especially as you mentioned at the start of this with Gaza, and suddenly noticing a starvation, which has been reported since the start. The warnings of this have been from the very start, and already actually before with the blockade. So suddenly now, newspapers and some politicians have decided to kind of about turn. But I think there's a really interesting concept in international law which isn't so strictly defined, which is complicity. And the problem is, I think in the case of Rwanda, they found that multiple news agencies were guilty um, with their reporting, lack of reporting of some aspects, but then also reporting other aspects, using this to be able to cover a genocide and to allow people to get away with it, or more importantly, to incite a genocide. These people are the problem. They must be removed. Um, and I think the problem with Western media is it is finding itself in that legal space of complicity. Some of them way more than others, but some people have reported on things which are not true, have no basis in fact, and have been proven to have no basis in fact. And yet the content of this information is so explosive. Its ramifications are difficult to describe because people will believe something, and it's very hard for people to unbelieve something. How do we reach people who are so sure that something has happened in this particular way? Our language becomes disjointed. The same with politicians. They realize, obviously, with Cameron, I would say, um, and now with Lamy, they both have an active participatory role within genocide. And so we'll have to answer if we do eventually end up in a situation where international crimes will then be charged in these cases, um, which
Yeah, I
doesn't
mean,
seem to be, it doesn't
that's right,
seem to
and that's what
be.
worries me. That will there actually be reckoning? Will there actually be, I mean, because this isn't the same case as with Rwanda, a relatively small, yeah, African country that was not at the center of so many geopolitical interests. I mean, we can certainly identify the way in which Israeli media has been silencing what's going on, has been avoiding showing the Israeli public what is being done in its name in Gaza. I don't know how much of that, you know, would have helped, to the degree
Mhm.
that, there's been such a sort of normalization of genocidal mentalities in so much of the public, um, while of course there is still resistance to it, and the political space for that is still somewhat open
Yeah.
in Israel, at least, at least for now. Um, it's just very hard just to imagine the scenario in which there is an actual accounting without something really fundamental happening in Washington, in
Yeah.
Moscow, in Berlin, in London, in Paris, in Beijing. So without without that kind of shift, and ultimately, I think that, and I've written about this in September. Like, Gaza is emblematic, I think, is the of processes that we're also seeing around climate change, processes that we're also seeing around, the species extinction and everything else. This is sort of the emblem of a civilization in collapse.
Absolutely.
It may not ever get any better, right? Like to imagine an end to the genocide in Gaza, it's almost like to imagine significant global action on climate change in a way, and
Hmm.
that is what creates so much despair around that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you know, a year before the fall of the Soviet Union, a year before the end of apartheid, no, in South Africa, nobody kind of predicted, or very few could have predicted that those things will change. So, I mean,
Absolutely.
while I have some sort of optimism that comes from seeing the increasingly progressive outlook of, you know, people, the younger they are, I'm really worried that that's going to be much too late for the Gazans, and that and
Absolutely.
that and that without, because we really are at the stage where we need acute, immediate intervention by the world powers to stop a genocide, and this, it's just very hard to see where that's going to come from.
Sure. You
But
cannot
still,
ask arms dealers, sorry to you cannot ask the arms dealers to stop something. It becomes like
well, I
this, and
mean,
yet the
unless
arms dealers are.
unless unless it
Sorry.
becomes too politically hazardous, right, for them. I mean, it's the politicians who are enabling the arms dealers. I mean, it's
Sure.
not as if this is such a significant part of the UK economy, right? Like this whole, it's the ties with the arms industry are much more part of this militarist ideological gambit that Labour has
Hmm.
decided to go on, right? I mean, we see this very consistently from Starmer, and again, we wrote about this a couple of months ago when the defense spending review came out, and
Yeah.
the whole kind of this kind of hitching bets on the military and military industries, and even bringing back, various forms of national service and conscription as something that I think on one hand is, again, just intended to appeal to Labour's imaginary reactionary electorate that they think they need to sway,
Yeah.
and on the other hand, just coming from, I think, this very small echo chamber that's around the kind of policymakers in the government at the moment. People who are completely out of touch with public opinion, with what's going on in the reality of people's lives, with the precarity, with the cost of living crisis, with people coming out of school, coming out of university with a huge debt, and just there being no real kind of job prospects that they were
Hmm.
promised,
Absolutely.
and and continuing to sort of also have this uh, totemic attitude to economic growth as a be all end all, as if environmentalist lessons have just gone through one ear and come out through the other, that you can't have infinite growth on a limited planet. So it just seems like really the like a government that is so intent on doing everything wrong
Hmm.
out of some, like, and I think I think it's more stupidity than malice in their case, and just this kind of very dim level of political thinking that, even on a strategic,
Yeah.
level of the power politics of electoralism doesn't make tons of sense.
It's a lesson for all of us, because I think, and taking away the apparatus just for a second of the Labour Party, if you have a movement of any group of people and you start excluding people, you're going to find yourself with an echo chamber, very small group of people who agree with you, and you agree with each other, and you see the world burning and you still agree that it's fine. They have divorced so many aspects of the Labour Party, which were still part of it, even if they were against it. For instance, Corbyn's involvement in the party was one that would go against it when it was in power. Now you don't really have these aspects anymore. They've kicked out these people from the party. So who is left except for people who realistically operate on this kind of yes man idea? It's just you just do your job. It's a hard job, you don't have to turn up if you don't want to, and you get more than 70,000 a year. And they should be terrified of talking to people, which is probably exactly what has happened. They turn up in limousines to a place that is electrified fences. The same with Buckingham Palace. These people are hiding. They go to do their thing. They collect their money, and they do not want to talk to us. And as we've seen in the past, some people decide to take matters into their own hands to be able to violently attack them. We haven't really even resolved that. We haven't had a conversation about why MPs were shot, by the way, from Labour MPs or Conservative MPs. No one wants to talk about that. It's just the fear, and then we move on. But there is a significant reason why people are pissed. There's a significant reason why riots are happening, and what effects this has on the rest of society. I also saw, for instance, after October the 7th, that there was a large increase in anti-Muslim hate reported by Tell Mama. That was 600% in, I think, a month. There are thousands and thousands of cases that come from these different aspects. We also talk about Palestine, but we also talk about then right-wing parties' reform and the Labour Party's reaction to them. And you're seeing what is happening. I think a lot of people are intelligent enough to see what is happening. And the hope that is there is that we have each other's back, that we don't exclude each other based on these false constructs that seem to divide us. We're together stronger, and we have to remember what worked, what did not work. We need to come together, and we need to focus our energy on the political task at hand. I think direct action appeals to many because it is action. We are not marching the streets in Whitehall and screaming at offices that are empty for some political change, which is still important. It is our right. But at the same time, the concept of taking action, not asking permission, but doing something that directly impacts the thing that you're trying to stop, that appeals to people, because people feel helpless. Social media is an echo chamber. You feel like you're passing on a message, but actually you're just enriching a fucking technological company. It becomes a madness, and people find themselves empty. They have, yeah, I've told everyone that they're starving, but no one gives a fuck. And what do I do now? And maybe we can just stop them delivering arms by getting in front of a door. And that is an extremely simple action. And by calling Palestine Action a terrorist organization has not in any way dealt with the fact that direct action appeals to many in Russia, United Kingdom, the United States, across the fucking world. This is something that communities, it's not just something of anarchism, it's something of communities, of all communities, to have something to fight back with. I think that's why it's targeted. To be
Yeah,
honest, it works.
yeah. Well,
It works.
on that optimistic note, I think it's time for us to conclude this edition of the Freedom Anarchist News Review. freedomnews.org.uk, freedompress.org.uk, and this is the opportunity to thank Josie O'Sullivan, who joined us tonight. I'm Freedom Editor Uri Gordon, and please follow and subscribe to the website. Follow us on Facebook, follow us on Blue Sky, follow us on Telegram. We are no longer on Twitter. Coming soon, Freedom.